All right, and we're live. Dylan,
Hello.
welcome back. Oh my
Thanks for
gosh.
having me.
Yes, of any time. This has been so great. I've enjoyed this. I've gone back and watched these, and I almost feel oddly like I've
I
learned
have
stuff. You know
too.
what I mean? Right? They've been fun, and we're getting some good feedback.
Yeah.
And by all means, as we said last time, if there's things we're missing from previous videos, from previous eras, if there's things that we need to hit on that you guys believe really critically right that we need to hit on sort of in future videos, let us know in the comments. We want to hear from you. We heard from some folks in the last video, so there's definitely some things we want to hit on based on that feedback. It's great. We want this to be sort of a collective history of the EU, as much even as much as it's sort of in some sense like our personal sort of take, right?
Hmm.
It would be neat to see other people sort of do their own sort of parallel histories, right? Because there's a lot of activity when it comes to
Yeah.
this post 2014 sort of life as an EU fan. So just a quick wrap up, right? In the very first video, which we'll link to in the bottom, we did basically pre 2014 through 2015. Last time we did 2016 through 2017. Now we're going to be taking a look at 2018 and 2019, and these are very full years. So there is a lot to get into. So, and again, I've said this in previous videos, want to reiterate here, this is not about the drama or the dirt. There are ups, there are downs. We'll talk about both. We certainly want to highlight the successes and highlight. I think we'll name names when there's like really positive things to highlight. Where there's negative things to highlight, again, we
Yeah.
don't want to get into the dirt, right? We
And
we
it's
want to acknowledge what the ups and downs, but right? We don't want to drudge it all back up again, right?
and
But
especially with kind of this era and I guess the next episode after this we get into more modern stuff. A lot of this stuff is still like really fresh. Like when we're talking 2014, 2015, that's almost like ancient history and like as far as internet goes. So we can talk a little bit more freely, even though we tried not to use names as many times as possible. We could talk a little openly. It might get a little bit more vague as we get closer to the present day with when we talk about some of the more negative things that have happened, just because out of respect for the people involved and all and how recent it's been and how at least for one of these things how it affected both of us.
yeah,
It's just something we have to do.
that's right. That's right. And that's what's been nice about the last couple. They've truly been histories, right? We're delving back archaeologically into the past. And yeah, the closer we get to the current time. In fact, it'd be interesting. In a couple of years, we'll probably want to do an update, right? And we may even
Yeah.
we'll redo the last video in this series, just depending on how things shake out. So let's dive in. Unless Dylan, anything else you want to do to set up the?
Just one thing we completely forgot. I had it highlighted here because we fought from the 2016. I don't think we
Yes.
talked about the new Heir to the Empire covers that came out.
I have a vague recollection. Maybe we talked about it after we sort of hung up, right, on the
Yeah.
call, right? But no, totally agree. Definitely worth highlighting.
Yeah, it was again like in 2016, like the fact that because we talked about this scare was that they were going to take the books, they were going to stop printing them, and that we weren't going to get anything, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, here's new cover art for the for Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Writing and Last Command, the Thrawn trilogy, and how again in retrospect we make fun of the new covers, and we've even uh, and Zahn has sort of lost prestige within the community for various reasons. I have an article on the Spangliverse.com about this, but at the time, that was a huge deal. That was a huge win. I remember lots of people going out to their like local bookstores to pick up these new copies to show support because again a lot of the different work we were doing at this time and even now was all about the overall point was we want to prove that that continuing legends would not only be a good idea but would be a profitable idea, that there was monies to be made, that they were leaving money on the table by not continuing this. And things like this were like things like the as I alluded to when the Imperial Handbook came out, or when the paperback of Honor Among Thieves came out. These were like our few chances to kind of prove that point of we still want this. We're still willing to buy it. We just want you to make more of it.
Well said. And I remember gleefully going out that afternoon. I still remember vividly where I bought them and what I was thinking and how excited it was to see something new with the Legends banner, new so to speak, with the Legends banner on it. Now, yeah, I mean, I remember at the time thinking, certainly don't feel like I need yet another edition of
Right.
Heir to the
Little
Empire,
little
but
little did we know how many times they're going to reprint that cover.
absolutely. And again, what's funny too, what's ironic is of all the EU cover art, the Heir to the Empire cover art in particular is among the more iconic. So of all the ones to update, kind of funny choice. But again, gleefully went out to support Legends, which is the thing that we were not only happy to do then, but as I've argued a number of times, probably in previous videos in this series, later in 2016, we did what? Put money for a billboard to prove how much more money we want to spend if only we get more books like that. So yeah, definitely worth going back and making sure we say something about that circa 2016. So okay, well, let's jump into 2018 because we got a lot to
Yeah.
cover. And in no particular order, the thing I think I would want to hit on here, it's something that I included on our list. It's the migration of the fandom from platforms like Facebook to other platforms. I think in particular YouTube, which I think takes on sort of an increased role of prominence in, I think, EU fans' daily sort of consumption of just content about the EU, but also information about the EU fandom, the EU movement. We talked in 2014 about how Facebook really seemed to play a central role in helping to sort of coalesce a movement within the fandom around 2014. And I think that although you could highlight YouTube, I think in general, it's just worth noting, and this is probably something we'll probably hit on in future sort of topics, future videos, there is an increasing distribution and even decentralization of the fandom and of the movement because of the proliferation of various platforms. But YouTube, I think, takes on sort of a special role.
Yeah, it certainly does. Because really, before this time, like maybe a little bit into 2017, excuse me, this changed. Maybe kind of as the again, it became cool to hate on Disney on YouTube. But really, prior to this era, if you wanted to go to YouTube for expanded universe content, it was like Matt, it was Jeremy, it was you, it was and like maybe a half dozen at best other channels were your options. And of those YouTube, like everyone know, like, oh, this is like the 7 or 8 like expanded universe YouTubers. That was it. And then around
Right.
2017, 2018, it just starts kind of exponentially expanding in how many YouTube channels there are just talking about EU legends. So many so that at this point there are like I haven't even heard of them all. Like I remember back in the day, I knew them all, like because I watched them all because that's all that
Right.
was there. But like every day I'm finding out about nowadays. Every day I'm finding out about some new guy who's going through and reviewing books or talking about the EU or has like a podcast or like a show where they talk about
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think even Eckhart's Ladder, which is now, a major YouTube, which has a lot to promote EU content. I think only got started around 2017 or something like that. I mean, I
Yeah,
think,
around that era.
newer in the grand scheme. Yeah, no, it's true. And we should clarify for anyone who's going to nitpick this. Of course, there was lots of various EU content on YouTube, but in terms of sort of the people whose channels were sort of primarily branded around sort of
Primarily EU and
yeah,
primarily like I guess like movement focus. I mean,
exactly.
there was
Yeah.
one YouTube channel that did primarily EU stuff prior to this. They used to go by I think they were Star Wars Explained, then they became Star Wars Minute, or I might have that backwards. But rapidly over time started doing more and more canon stuff and less legend stuff. So there were
Mhm.
people like that. There was also people like the Council Forcecast who did a lot of the Versus series on YouTube,
Right.
who different members had sort of very differing opinions um, on the EU movement. Some were very in favor of it, others were at the opposite side, but at least they were also making EU content.
Right.
But again, still, the numbers back then were very limited.
That's right. That's right. That's right. By the way, and speaking of nitpickers, for anyone who's just watching this video out of order, who hasn't seen the previous two, do you want to clarify for them what you mean jokingly about how post Last Jedi it was cool to dunk on Disney? Do you want to just clarify what
Yeah.
that's not to say that the EU movement is about dunking on Disney. To
Oh,
the
no.
contrary, right? So
So, yeah, what I mean by that is essentially when the decanonization happened, and for some people, when the buyout from Disney happened, there were a lot of skeptical voices that were like, I don't agree to this. I don't think this is a good move. And I would like this to change. And prior to The Last Jedi coming out, the cultural perception around Disney was more or less that they could basically do nothing wrong, and that you were the weirdo for questioning their decisions or whatnot. And then The Last Jedi happens, and all of a sudden it's okay to question and say bad things about Disney and criticize their, not that it's okay, but like, the court of public opinion had shifted
Right.
from pro Disney to anti Disney pretty much overnight with the release of The Last Jedi. And as we'll get into in this year's particularly, that does have a fairly big effect on the EU movement, as in a lot of ways, good and bad, actually, I think, as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's always a bit of a mixed bag. Yeah. Do you want to hit up the next couple here on our list? I think
Sure.
very interesting topics for sure. And I think this next one sort of relates to this, to the extent that we have to kind of continue to refine and re-message and constantly re-message what it is we're actually aiming at, right?
hmm So, yeah, are you talking about the second or third one?
The continuation one.
Yeah, the continuation. So this was an era, and again, this is another one that we could have talked about in 2016 or 2017, but I think really by 2018 we started to get this 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 perception that it seemed that as we had now reached the various powers to be, and that we knew that they knew that they were around, we started seeing this thing happen where they would take EU characters and put them in the new canon. Like they were almost misinterpreting what it was we wanted. We wanted, as it says, we wanted a continuation of these stories, not for them to be incorporated into the new canon. And this rapidly over time just became more and more of a fight as character after character, after story arc after story arc, after like reference and callback after reference and callback got to what was once legends got put into the new canon, and people going, "Isn't this great? Isn't what you want us? Look at this reference," and we're going, "No, this isn't what we want. We want it to be separate." They said they wanted their creative freedom. That's what they said. Use your creative freedom.
Yeah, use it exactly. And and you started to see, Terry was very good about this. She might have even helped develop this hashtag. I don't know, but you started to see hashtag continuation, not integration, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. And that's been a constant challenge with the EU movement, is constantly having to sort of refine the messaging. You know, we talked last time about how the one unfortunate downside of the otherwise successful Billboard campaign in 2016, right, is that lots of people misinterpreted or read too much into the continue legends. Well, wait, what do you mean continue? Continue? We can't get rid of the new movies. That's not what we want. Continue it alongside a parallel path to the new canon. You know, a phrase that I've probably said a billion times by now, but also hashtag continuation, not integration. And as I was sort of keen of reminding folks at the time, I mean, just flip the script and see how absurd it would be to say, you know, hey, great, well, let's continue Legends, but make sure that Kylo Ren and BB-8 are characters, and the continuation of, say, the the X-Wing Rogue Squadron series or something, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, just think about how absurd it is, right? There was a clean break, and let's take them at their word. There was a clean break for creative freedom. Well, great, tell the parallel story. But at the minimum, understand that if Thrawn shows up in Rebels, it is by definition a different Thrawn. It is someone who looks like that character, who has vaguely similar background, whose name is Thrawn, who is not Thrawn. When you started to see the excitement about, oh, I think Dash Rendar's ship is in this show or in this footnote or something like that, it's not a ship. It's a ship that resembles that, but has now been introduced into the new canon, into the new continuity, and is in no way even really is in no way a real continuation. So yeah, it was something that we had to kind of keep reiterating, and in particular because I think to go back to the previous thread, I think this new awakening of the fandom for folks who had stuck around through Last Jedi, who didn't like it for whatever reason, whether it's because they were, you know, Fandom Menace outragers or something, or just, you know, YouTubers looking to monetize, any number of reasons why people post 2017 started to sort of look for things they didn't like about the new direction of Disney. What you sometimes saw those folks say is, boy, you know, I stuck with Force Awakens, I stuck with Last Jedi. Now, you know what? Just go back to the good stuff. Make sure Luke gets married in episode 9. Make sure it's Mara Jade, right? And you're like, no. The response isn't to, double down on this new thing. It's to say very simply, there was a clean break in 2014. All you have to do is continue the old along the new.
Mhm.
It's that simple, right? So, but that was definitely
Yeah, and
something we had to keep remessaging.
I think that's a great point. Again, with the Last Jedi is, and it kind of gets into what we're talking about in this era is that the discontent with the direction that the sequels were taking to Last Jedi brought a lot of people to the EU fandom because, as I said at the time, and I still said, it was one of the best things that could have happened for us. Because okay, if you're not happy with where they took the story, there's another storyline that
Right.
I think is a lot closer to what you imagined as a kid happened, and it's there. It's there. You just have to read it. And if you could help us out, get more. But it also that sort of thing got a lot of more people into Legends and then into the movement that didn't that weren't around in the earlier years. So
Hmm.
we had a big influx in people who again were like really hyped, were really enjoying it, and really wanted to do something. And a
Right.
lot of the great successes and some of the even the more controversial or low times were I think um, have a lot to do with that influx that we got in and kind of incorporating all these new people into the movement, into the broader community, and ironing out like what it is educating them on where we've been and what it is we're trying to do, and figuring all that out.
Yeah, that was an interesting, challenge. That movement intake, right? That
Mhm.
constant sort of always sort of fighting several sort of messaging fronts, trying to continue to sort of convince fans of the new canon what it is we want, what it is we don't want, convincing Lucasfilm what it is we want, what we don't want, but also as new folks are joining not just the EU fandom, but then interested in, as you say, sort of being doers in the EU movement, trying to catch them up on everything
Mhm.
that's been tried, everything that's worked, hasn't worked, what we believe, what we don't believe. And also in some cases too, to the extent that they were where we were in 2014,
Right.
briefly angry and trying to sort of take that and canalize it into something more productive, more positive, right?
And a more
Yeah.
unforeseen benefit that I was actually thinking about after we recorded the last one was a lot of the people, like the people online that were like so anti what we were trying to do and were constantly being like a thorn in our side and jumping on everything. Around this era, they started to get more and more less and less prevalent within what we were doing because all of a sudden we weren't the only ones disagreeing with what like their attention was now divided. Like their attention used to solely just be on us because we were the only discontented group, but now there were multiple different discontented groups, and their brains started to broaden, and they started getting into all these other camps, and it kind of like a lot of those people that we talked about in the last one, they're not really around anymore, at least
Mhm.
directly to us. Like they're still around, but they're not really bothering us anymore. They're bothering other people, which is
That's right.
uh,
That's right. And this provided an interesting opportunity for differentiation because we always have been, and I think at this point, I think increasingly started to be seen positively, in my opinion, as the loyal opposition.
mhm,
Think about it in almost British parliamentary terms. We again, I can't state it enough. Fundamentally, the EU movement is about wanting to work with Lucasfilm
mhm.
to convince them to greenlight more Lucasfilm greenlit projects. Like we want more. We want more continuation on integration. We want more EU. Give us Legends. We're the loyal opposition. We're not trying to tear it down. And I think that to go back to something that we talked about just a few minutes ago, not only did people who felt disenfranchised by what they didn't like about the new canon, not only did some of them join our ranks around this time, but I actually think, and we've seen this recently, I think there are people who are a little older now who are in the movement, who are in the fandom, who were younger when some of these new canon films came out. And guess what? They liked them. That was their introduction to Star Wars. So being introduced to this and then a couple years later realizing that wow, there's a deep 40 plus year history, I want to know more about the old stuff, they've joined us too, and that's what's
Mhm.
interesting, right? So there's a pretty diverse, so those films really ultimately were an amazing recruitment tool for us, both in terms of the people who didn't like it, who wondered what's this other stuff that they're not doing, but also again, we don't forget there's a positive side is the people who did like it and just wanted more Star Wars. And what
Mhm.
did we say in 2017? And I think we forgot to mention this last time. What's the thing we started saying? And I think say to the same, more Star Wars for everyone,
Yep.
more of the new
More Star
canon,
Wars is
but
good for
more for
everyone.
us, right? And that fundamentally, and I think that this post 2017 into 2018 period allowed us to say to everyone, the problem, so to speak, with Star Wars is not that the new stuff is going off in some direction, which frankly we don't care about because we're not following the new stuff. The problem, so to speak, with Star Wars is that there's not enough of the old. It's that simple, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and okay, and speaking of of I was trying to think of
Haters.
what's that?
Speaking of people who were no longer an issue,
Yes, exactly. Chuck Wendig is booted.
this is
Yeah,
such an
boy,
interesting thing because from like a from like a purely from a Legends standpoint, right? A Legends fan doesn't really care about Chuck Wendig or anything,
right,
really. Like
right.
it more of just came down to this the with how antagonistic he was towards us. I mean, his passive aggressive open letter to us after the Billboard. It was kind of this weird thing of, oh, he got fired. That's
Mhm,
interesting,
mhm.
sad and funny at the same time.
Yeah. I did a video about it at the time, and I titled it "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly." You know, there was a certain Schadenfreude in it, right? To the extent that he'd been one of our major antagonists, and yet I didn't agree with the circumstances around
I
which
didn't
he
either.
he was fired. I thought it was kind of silly, and it was the beginning of some of the not to get political here. It was sort of the beginning of some of this early kind of cancel culture stuff. Frankly, I don't even remember at this point what any of the reasons were. And interestingly, it does seem as if he's been able to maintain something like back channels to some of the old editors and whatnot at Del Rey. They
Mhm.
continue to sort of interact and stuff on Twitter. So I'm sure behind the scenes everything's fine, but there was some huge optics war or something he lost, and it's again the good, the bad, the ugly. People can watch that video. I don't even remember entirely what I say in that, but I just remember thinking, yeah, it's let's not completely dance around and cheer. Ultimately, to your point, this isn't really how is this a victory for the EU? In fact, again, we'll always be able to thank Chuck Wendig for essentially inspiring um,
Mhm.
to some degree, right? The Twin Sons Foundation and
Yeah,
taking all of this momentum and actually doing good with it, right? Do you
and
want to set
also,
that up because we didn't talk about that before?
yeah. So this is another thing I don't think we talked about with the Billboard criticism. Another one was the common thing of, oh, again, one of the most common complaints about the Billboard was you guys wasted all that money on a billboard when you could have used money for a different, more important thing, and it was
Hmm.
almost always charity. You couldn't have got it to charity. You could have done something better
Hmm.
with it. And I guess this is a thing that like any like it's such a non-argument because you can say it about like literally anything. It's like you could have bit you could have spent your money better. Okay, but it's what we wanted to spend the money on. And
Right.
again, we eventually did end up becoming a charity. Even with the billboard, we raised more money than what we actually needed, and we were able to buy 22 books with that money to send to the I think it was the Dobson Ranch Library in Mesa, Arizona, um, specifically. Um, and that wasn't a thing that uh, chronologically, it was a thing that happened after we had gotten all that backlash. But realistically, that was always the plan. The plan was if we get more money than we actually need, we will use it to buy books to donate to a library somewhere. Because again, we didn't want to profit off of this, right? We didn't want
Right.
to.
Right.
We didn't. We were raising money for this purpose, and if we got more money than we needed, we weren't going to take any of that for ourselves. We thought that was wrong, and that ended up being the the precursor to what Twin Sons would eventually become.
Right. Right. So it was really great eventually when Chuck Wendig comes around to say, "Hey, you guys are wasting money on the billboard. Why not do something charitable?" It's like hold my beer and my Legends books because look what I just did, right? So
Fifth, I believe, um, one of the two fundraisers at the time of recording, one of the two fundraisers that we did in August, One of those events has gone down. The other is going down this weekend. So at the end of this weekend, we will have donated over 1,500 books at Twin Suns, cumulatively over the course of our existence.
Yeah. Put 1,500 EU books into the hands of young people in need. So, the EU fandom is a force for good. It just needs to be said. And we shouldn't be the ones to say that, but I think that record sort of,
Right.
I think, speaks for itself. They're in children's hospitals, they're in libraries, keeping the EU alive, community centers, but sparking an interest in reading, and also, trying to brighten the day of in some cases kids who are in tough spots with Star Wars. So, and in conjunction with other fan groups, and particularly the 501st, right, a very well respected fan group. So it's just been great. It's the Twin Suns work, I just think is unimpeachable. It's fantastic charitable work. So, and again, it's one of the things, it's like EU related charity brought to you by the Star Wars EU fandom, right? So,
yep.
Okay, let's talk about saving the Clone Wars. Hashtag Save the Clone Wars, and the success of the Save the Clone Wars movement, right?
So this is, I'm maybe not the best to talk about this, but everyone I've talked about it with, at least within the movement, have all come to the same conclusion. The Save the Clone Wars movement has been around for ostensibly as long as the EU movement has been around, because again, Clone Wars got canceled around the same time that the EU got canceled. But unlike with the EU one, I genuinely, having been in this world for at that long, I genuinely can't think of anything the Save the Clone Wars people did. I don't know anyone who was a part of it. I just know it was a hashtag on Twitter, and there were some people behind it, and that they eventually got Clone Wars back, as I think it would be either late 2018 or early 2019 that it was officially announced. In fact, it might have been at Celebration, I think. Chicago, that they got it back.
That part of the timeline is fuzzy for me, but I, as I'm sure many of us did, I had very mixed feelings about that, because it was one of those things that I wasn't necessarily fighting for, particularly in the way that it was ultimately sort of achieved, because in case anyone's unclear, the final season they got is not set within the EU continuity. To put aside any of the larger debate about TCW and continuity pre-2014 in any event, but at the same time, it was one of those things where, okay, at least it was something to give us a little bit of injection of hope to say, okay, it's not as if Lucasfilm has completely forgotten about the pre-2014 past, but of course it's also true that, I mean, even though it was canceled very unceremoniously pre-2014, I think probably even to like Filoni's surprise, and what's my evidence for this? There's that whole, unproduced final season, right, that we got snippets of online. But ultimately, come on, I mean, I think given Filoni's
they kept him around, and they kept him in content. It was only a matter of time before he pushed and got them to greenlight it again.
That's exactly right. And so I think it's really hard to generalize anything that, even if the Save the Clone Wars movement had been doing more visible things, all billboards, charitable, Twin Suns, I mean, the list goes on. Even if they'd done anything comparable like that, I think it's hard to actually draw a straight line from that to, this is the thing that did it, right? There were definitely those who wanted to say we should do more of what they did. But again, to your point, I don't know what it was beyond. Admittedly, there were some Facebook groups I was a part of, some fairly large Facebook groups, right? But beyond that, what was the product? I don't really know.
Yeah,
right?
This isn't to say, by the way, that they did nothing. We can't say that for certain because we simply don't know. But it's more of to say as something that was, as people who were involved in something that was sort of tersely related, we only knew them, the fact that they existed. We only knew that they existed, not what they were doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. This is a bizarre analogy that of course I would present here, since this is a video of two Southern Californians. But I remember about 20 years ago when the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles wanted to secede, and so did, I think, parts of southern Los Angeles, like around San Pedro. And so they were these two simultaneous secession movements within Los Angeles County. Both knew about one another. One was slightly more likely, to the extent that it had just more money and financial interest behind it, San Fernando Valley. And the San Pedro movement or whatever it was. There was some Southern Los Angeles movement that wanted to do this too. And I remember there was sort of this sense that they both knew one another existed. They weren't sure what either was doing, but there was sort of this belief among some that, well, if one works, they'll kind of help us out. But in reality, if that one works, well, then you have less interest group now inside that city to help pull you along too, right? I think in a weird way, it's like with the Save the Clone Wars movement, in essence, having succeeded, so to speak. Well, I think there were a number of people where, to the extent there was overlap, well, they got what they wanted. They were fine. They weren't gonna help pull us along, you know. Maybe a horrible analogy, but I just kind of think there was this sort of this kind of parallel sort of thing that kind of made sense. And I used to look at whatever it was I thought it was, to the extent I could find it online pre the return. I used to think, well, that's cool. They're kind of a part of this coalition. But again, once they got that season 7, it wasn't really sure then what sort of relationship we were going to have. And I think it was interesting. The one Facebook group I was in, or Facebook page, at least I was following, about Save the Clone Wars, it was interesting to see what they did after this happened. They had this kind of existential sort of debate about what do we do? And instead of just retiring the page, they sort of converted it into just a sort of a general Star Wars fan community, which is a great, totally their prerogative, but clearly didn't sort of then have the continued focus. What do you focus on? Which is something maybe hopefully one day we'll have the same problem to have to solve, right? But
yeah. And I also think a lot of the crossover, like the lack of crossover, came from the fact that about 70 to 80% of the movement has a very negative opinion of the Clone Wars, at least when it comes to the Legends continuity and what it did. And I almost wonder if, there was never really, it was a completely separate movement essentially. And there was some crossover. There were some people in the community, even back then, that were very positive on TCW, but the general conception was if you had those thoughts, you kind of kept it to yourself because you'd very quickly get out shouted down by everyone else.
For sure. We didn't get into this before, but I think it's worth it since we're just on the topic of the Clone Wars. This has obviously been one of the most controversial, heated, divisive topics within the fandom and the movement since 2014. I have earned the distinction of having been booted from a number of Facebook EU groups in those early days for expressing certain views about the Clone Wars, which I guess weren't deemed politically correct by some of the admins at the time. And I've actually had the interesting experience of having met a number of people in the fandom years later in other groups who we realized were booted at the same time. So we get to sort of wear that like a badge of honor. The thing with the Clone Wars is it's amazing how it's this laboratory for just sort of like people not hearing one another and miscommunication, right? I mean, it's because it takes a bit of nuance to appreciate, of course. And I guess I will just risk offending more people by just stating what I think is probably the mainline EU fandom view, which is that, of course, you're by all means welcome to like it or love it, right? But when it comes to continuity, it obviously poses a huge problem. But when it comes to canonicity, we have to address the obvious fact that pre-2014, it was part of the hierarchy of canon. Now, this gets complicated by T-canon. So in some sense, for a while, it's viewed as in some way sort of even higher than anything else we know about the Clone Wars. That's what creates lots of sort of like aggravation on behalf of lots of EU fans, myself included. But I think post-2014, when a lot of what we needed to do was just start establishing facts about what the EU was and what it wasn't in the face of criticism from new canon fans, it became very important, in my opinion, to simply sort of remind people that you might not like the show, you might love the show, you might think that it's in continuity, you might believe it completely blasts continuity, which is what I tend to think it does, but it, for better or worse, pre-2014 was part of the canon, and that's something that needed to be addressed, and that one of the reasons why the decanonization discontinuation was so annoying is that it prevented the opportunity of Leland Shee and others at Lucasfilm to actually make sense of the contradictions. And so it kind of locked that in stone, and that's a huge problem with it. So, and for expressing that view, I occasionally find myself on the wrong side of the EU fandom, but it's one of those sort of ongoing debates. But yeah, I'm sure I'll get criticism in the comments for having said whatever I said. Anything else on Clone Wars before we move on?
No, I mean, it's such an interesting, because there's not it's such this thing where it's this constant battle, and it's like this constant thing that gets brought up, but there's not really much to it. It's just that argument of it breaks continuity. It it got brought into the new canon, whereas the rest of Legends didn't. But it's still part of the canon. Not only is it part of the canon, but other works within the EU directly reference its retcons, and
Right.
and not just like well-respected books, within the books and comics within the EU community, such as Plagueis, Kenobi, make references to things that are even Fate of the Jedi. If you want to get into the post story, post Endor story, all reference the parts of TCW that contradict the rest of the EU. So it's that it's just a mess, and it's a mess that we're still waiting to get cleaned up.
It's a mess. It's a mess. It's exactly right. And again, the canonization discontinuation is one of the reasons why we're still waiting, because it gave Lucasfilm the opportunity just to basically wipe its hands about this sort of thing. So again, just to be charitable, right? Because I see the multiple sides of this. Again, someone will look at the mess and say, well, that's why in my head canon it's S canon or it's infinities or any number of things. But as you said, that's a large number of dominoes that has to fall because of all the things you then have to sort of take off the shelf in order to do that. Do I wish in some sense that it was never a thing in the first place? Yeah, I guess partially because of the mess. Also because I don't know how you perfect the Tartakovsky Clone Wars from 2003, 2005 in the first place. But again, in terms of establishing facts, which is something I think the EU movement needed to do post 2014 in the face of criticism, you just had to accept that it begrudgingly, right, that it was part of the hierarchy of canon, for better or worse. And I think it's totally fine to hedge and haw and add as many prefaces as you need to sort of make that clear. So you can actually believe both things, both that it was an unnecessary mess and that for better or worse it was part of the pre-2014. And again, we'd been through this before in the EU well before 2014. Again, when we learn about the retconned origins of Boba Fett, right? Well, okay, the EU finds a way. The EU fundamentally was not given a chance post 2014 to kind of help figure this stuff out. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we were a little grumpy when that happened in 2014, right? So, okay, so the Solo movie comes out, and I guess the perception is sort of a flop, right?
Yeah. I said this at the time as well, and I think a lot of people took it out of context, but I genuinely believe that they knew that it was going to flop. They knew that it was going to flop, that the backlash to Last Jedi was great, so they kind of did as much as they could to give them as many inbuilt excuses for it flopping to not scare the shareholders, basically. Mainly in because at this point all the Disney movies had come out in December, and that was a very deliberate purpose for that, because December is kind of a dead month when it comes to like movie releases. There's really nothing else out, so it got most eyes on it. And then Solo comes out in May, sandwiched between two other of the Marvel releases. They made that decision to put it in May next to those, and then they cited that as the reason of why it's not selling well. I think that was intentional. I think they knew it was coming, and I think they shot themselves in the foot to give them the excuse, if that makes sense.
Interesting. The thing I remember the most about that period of time is that going back to the continuation, not integration argument, I remember there being a lot of excitement and buzz and a lot of the pop culture nerd news sites about how there's going to be a special cameo just for the EU fans with Tag and Bank, and they're going to be comedic characters, whooping it up in the background. And all you could think was, oh, okay, you're going to give us two characters who were non-canon in the EU continuity in this new, and that's the big giveaway.
Or people speculating that they're going to take from the Brian Daly or A.C. Kurtzman trilogy, and they're gonna pick and choose little aspects and make little references to them in that. And again, it's like that's not what we want. We want them to be creative. They wanted their creative freedom. We wanted them to take that. But again, in every kind of poetically, in every in every defeat there is a victory, because if it wasn't for that movie, we have a little later on this list, but it comes up. If it wasn't for that movie, we wouldn't have gotten the Barnes and Noble hardcover of the Han Solo trilogy, which came out around the same time, and almost certainly was basically a promotional stunt to, go with the movie, and kind of maybe a cash grab, but one that was very welcome to people because those books, especially in hardcover, are very hard to come by. So just having a 3-in-1 that looked fairly nice on the shelf that you could put with all your other hardcovers was, for a lot of people, very desirable.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll probably talk about this when we talk about, we get into our 2021 video, but with the Essential Legends collection being introduced by Del Rey, it's certainly the case that some of the choices they made are just for cynical market tie-in purposes. But hey, who cares, right? If that's introducing new fans to that stuff, great. The fact that you can now still see Legends books in like a Target because of the Essential Legends, even if it's for cynical tie-in reasons to films or whatnot, well, it works for me. So yeah, absolutely. I added this one here. I'll talk about this really
Yeah.
briefly.
You
It's
know more
Nathan
about it than I
Butler.
do.
Okay, yeah. So Nathan Butler basically quits the Star Wars fandom practically over a variety of issues. And he's got a great video that I encourage anyone who's not familiar with Nathan Butler or this video to go and check out. It's from around 2018. It's where he announces that he's going to basically end updating Star Wars Timeline Gold. Nathan Butler, for folks who don't know, is someone who is like an OG Star Wars fan. He's from the earliest days of the World Wide Web. Is one of the major forces in early chronological timeline building. I mean, he is someone who himself actually has contributed to the EU. He wrote one of the actual canon Star Wars Tales comic stories about Kyle Katarn, which actually very coolly for him ended up as one of those comic action figure packs that they used to sell. It had that Tales issue with the Katarn and then the Katarn figure, really, really neat. He was someone who did some really deep digging. I mean, extremely knowledgeable about Star Wars chronologically. He was someone who's actually helped settle some issues about when I think he helped figure out exactly like which month the Jaina and Jason, the twins,
that
were
was the
conceived,
thing
things
with
like
him.
that. Right?
He was getting down to the month, and sometimes even down to like the week that events were happening to make it all kind of fit together.
That's right. And over the years, and by the way, and again, it can't be overstated just how important he was in terms of keeping interest alive in the EU in the early days of the World Wide Web. An amazing resource, an amazing collection. I'm proud to say I have something, an obscure piece of EU from his collection, because sadly he sold some of it off after this. But for a variety of reasons, he decided to stop updating this thing called Star Wars Timeline Gold. And for everyone who doesn't know, it's still available. Just Google it on his website. And it is an insanely detailed, comprehensive overview from multiple different lenses and angles of the Star Wars continuity. And he even started to update the new canon continuity too. He's now moved into, he still has a YouTube channel, but he's moved into sort of a focus, a kind of a niche focus on collecting all of the home video releases for anything Star Wars. He's actually written and self-published several books about tracking down different VHS, Laserdisc copies of this, that, the others. It's interesting stuff. Very niche stuff, but very interesting. He even, pre-2014, had finally begun a really, really important publication order review of EU. And I forget, he didn't get very far before the decanonization announcement and just sort of decided, look, I'm going to go all in. I'm a Star Wars guy my whole life. I'm going to go all in. I'm going to stop this review of the EU and I'm going to start diving into the new canon. By 2018, he's basically done. And he goes through some reasons why. And to be fair, some of it is because of what he has seen in the fandom, in this sort of this post Last Jedi divisiveness and toxicity in the fandom. He doesn't like that, right? But he also doesn't like the fact that, just basically, maybe clumsily paraphrase some of his arguments. He doesn't like the fact that, only 4 years prior to this, Lucasfilm was sort of selling a bill of goods about how the new canon was going to be all on the same tier and all continuity laden. There was going to be a story group keeping things focused, right? And how quickly that seemed to sort of unravel, how quickly we realized, for instance, that like the story group didn't seem to have much control over the new films and how little it seemed to tie into the story.
Nothing changed, basically, that it was the same old SC canon kind of,
that's right.
SCG canon kind of
yeah.
world.
And the interesting thing about Nathan Butler, and there's a few prominent Star Wars fans like this who are doers, who built resources. I would include Joe Bongiorno among them, Eddie Van de Heiden, a few others. They view the Star Wars continuity in a very unique way, in a very precious way. They view it as chronologists. They really see it as something real, and they really try, like historians, to really make sense of exactly when things happen. And so for them, it's incredibly important that we can be able to make some educated deductions about exactly when the twins were conceived and exactly how long it would take Han to get to Cloud City from,
Mhm.
you know, and in the new canon, he starts to argue about how all of a sudden things start to get too general. They basically say, "Oh yeah, well this book, it takes place this year. It takes place, but oh, this new story, yeah, it takes place between episode 4 and episode 5. Go figure it out," right? And this starts to sort of wear on him. I think probably fundamentally as a chronologist, someone who was so obsessively sort of cataloging this stuff for decades, for a variety of factors, he basically just gives up. And unfortunately, Star Wars Timeline.gold's no longer being updated. And what was really sad was that, again, like I said, he started selling off his collection. I got some of it. I'm glad to sort of give it a better home. I can't imagine. I can't imagine doing that with my collection, right? These treasures. But that's just how badly it seemed someone who had stuck with it, right? A hardcore dedicated Star Wars / EU fan, absolutely hardcore dedicated, one of the most knowledgeable, resourceful among us, stuck with it post 2014. And by 2018, is at a point where he liquidates his entire EU collection.
Mhm.
Devastating. So, may give it what you will, but it's
And
definitely an important moment in the fandom.
yeah, and he's not, by the way, the only one. I've talked about this. I've talked about this in the previous episodes. There were a lot of like genuinely very active members of the community, very much doers that, for one reason and over, essentially gave up and left the community, left Star Wars even for a variety of different reasons. And it's it's just kind of the nature of the beast. It's
Mhm.
especially something that's gone on as long as it's did. There's just going to be these. It feels weird to say this, but kind of like casualties to the cause.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's right. And I feel like what was interesting about him though is that he was, you know, I'm not trying to put him up on a pedestal, but he was something of an institution, at least to me.
Mhm.
And that was a pretty major kill shot, I think, when
Yeah.
he ended that his involvement in cataloging the Timeline Gold. So, um, you mentioned the solo trilogy. We sort of hit on this in a previous video, and I basically the French Legends book licensee losing the license to republish this. I remember this happening in 2018, but this is something that, as we alluded to in previous videos, is something that had happened in lots of different countries, would continue to happen for a while, is maybe, I think, even happening today. And I think, again, I'm still always fuzzy about this, but I think it's the case that in Germany, the
Mhm.
comics license, I think, has run out for whoever it was that was publishing these things. And basically just the republication line just abruptly stopped. And again, in many of these countries outside North America, some of the licensees never had full reproduction rights anyway. So audiences were only getting part of the EU, and now they're getting nothing new. So very unfortunate. So again, I just remember in 18, there's a very vibrant French EU community and EU fandom,
Mhm.
and I remember making some connections with them at this time. They wanted to get the word out, so
Yeah.
very felt very, 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 very sad for our French EU brethren. Um, I also added too that I seem to remember planning discussions for the second Billboard outside Lucasfilm beginning in 2018. I tried my best to remember when some of those calls happened. I swear I have a recollection of us talking about this in 2018. Is that right?
Yeah. Um, I think it was 2018. It may have been 2019. Actually, before we get into that, maybe it might be from a chronological list, just kind of go through the different like periods of post original Billboard, like what we had thought of, like
Hmm.
different campaign ideas that we had. Because
Yeah.
I remember right after the first Billboard, the thought process of was, okay, let's go bigger. Let's, instead of putting a billboard outside of Lucasfilm's office, let's go to their boss and put one outside of Disney's office. And then
Right.
I remember driving down to Burbank. It was like I live like an hour and a half away from Burbank, basically. Three during rush hour, because that's just how traffic is. Um,
Yeah.
and walking around scouting out locations, and I quickly found there are no billboards anywhere near the the office for Disney. At best, we'll get like some bus stops, maybe. So that got thrown out the window. We
And by the way, can I just say again, as a Los Angelino, how exceptional that is? And for anyone who doesn't live in Southern California, the thing that's hard to appreciate, because Dylan, you've lived around the
Mhm.
country, but you've lived in some bigger cities where this is somewhat similar to Los Angeles. But this is the thing that's really hard to believe once you've lived in Southern California long enough. You forget that in most cities, there aren't big billboards on every corner for
Mhm.
movies. That's an LA thing and a big city thing in some degree, but in LA, it's really true. I don't know. I mean, do you agree with me? Do you
Yeah,
know what I mean? It's hard for people to understand that. Like, if you're from Southern California and you like maybe like move away for college or something, one of the things you notice immediately is that, wait a minute, why? First of all, why aren't these movies like in the theater on opening weekend, right? Because again, because everything opens in LA first, but why isn't there a bus shelter poster for every movie playing right now on every single corner, which in LA
mhm.
there is? So the fact that in Burbank, where a huge part of the entertainment industry is situated, there were billboards nearby is crazy. So again, it would have been a great idea, but it's really, really unbelievably not
the next
possible, right? So
the next thing we thought about was, okay, let's get an advertisement in Star Wars Insider, right? Because the thought process
mhm,
was, we've reached out to Lucasfilm. We know that they know we're out there. Let's reach out to the fandom to let any of them that were also disenfranchised by the discontinuation or just don't even know about us are there. And we quickly found out that it is actually more expensive to buy a full page advertisement in a magazine than it is to buy a billboard in a major metropolitan area,
mhm.
which you would not think is the case, especially in like 2017, 2018ish when we were looking into it. But uh yeah, I think the billboard cost roughly $4,500 if I remember correctly. A one-page ad was $6,000 and a two-page ad was $12,000. So, anywhere from 50% to like three times the uh, the price of a billboard we could get the ad. And the other thing about this, and a few others as well that I'll get into, was, at least for me, my thought process behind all these campaigns was that, like, I don't want to do something just to say that I'd done it, you know? Like, oh, it would
Mhm.
be if the argument for doing something is it would be cool if we did something, and that's the only argument, I'm generally not in favor because what does it accomplish? The billboard's purpose, well, yes, it did get media coverage and it got put us all on the map, which was great, but the main purpose was we want Lucasfilm employees to see the billboard and to know that we're out. Not only we're out there, but we're how serious we are about what we want, and we accomplished that goal.
Yeah.
The one in Burbank for Disney would have essentially accomplished the same thing, but we didn't have anything. Well, we didn't have anything to go off of there, so we abandoned that. But with the Insider one, it was what's the purpose then? Is it to get
Right.
people to Twin Suns? Does it get people in the movement? Like how do we advertise ourselves in like a newspaper ad or in a magazine ad that actually brings them to us? Like how do we verify that the message got out and that it was heard and we actually are seeing the dividends of what we put out there? And that's
Right.
ultimately what killed that. Another one that we had, which was again kind of a half-hearted idea. We didn't put I don't think we put more than a couple weeks of thought into this, but we started looking around other ways that we could use for advertisements. And one of the things we found was that we could buy, I think it was 80 30-second advertisement slots on the Disney Channel for around the cost of a billboard. And again, it was a, okay, this would be really cool. It'd be really
Right.
funny to say. but what's the messaging? What's the purpose? What are we trying to get out of it? And we couldn't answer those questions in like a meaningful way, so it never got off the shelf. And then the final one, which you have highlighted here, was the Jade Shannon McRandle Walk of Fame star, which was like another one. It was like it would be really cool to give her one, especially as she was going through a lot of medical problems. For those of you who don't know, Shannon McRandle was the actress that Lucasfilm Disney wasn't in the picture yet, hired to be the for several photo shoots, promotional images, and I think also one of the Dark Forces games, if I'm not mistaken.
Decipher, I think it was one of the Decipher cards, right?
Decipher cards, yeah.
Yeah.
To play Mara Jade. And she was big in the community. Not as active, but she definitely knew about us. She had helped out. She had helped out promotion for both the Billboard and later when we went on to Star Wars Celebration. She had actually donated 30 signed prints of her that we could give out at the booth.
Got one of those, yep.
For people who had donated books to us. So very much a although not an active member of the community, and that in the day-to-day sort of grind, very much a respected member of the community at that.
Very much so. And by the way, and someone who, by the way, who had a vested interest in wanting to see Mara Jade in Episode 9, and yet was a vocal advocate for continuation, not integration. Yeah, very powerfully, I think. Yeah.
And the thing is, it would be a nice gesture. It would it was actually, again, more expensive than the Billboard, but it would be a really nice it would be a really nice venture to do. And it was like we could do it, but and this was kind of a heated debate amongst the movement of would it be worth it, essentially, to do this really nice thing for this actress that would kind of not impact us in any way. And we never really got the support that we could on that, and it kind of just fell through as an idea that gets brought up every now and then of we can do this, and we just can't find the support for it.
Right. And it just goes to show there was a lot of strategic thinking behind a lot of these steps at the various points, right? It wasn't just that like willy-nilly a billboard went up. Again, there's sort of there's thinking about what's the goal, what's the value, what's the messaging, what's the communication strategy, what should we actually have it say, and so on and so forth. And I'm glad you make this point. I mean, it's true. At a baseline level, you can justify anything, right? Businesses do this all the time. They go, oh, you know what? Let's send Joe Blow to this conference. Why? Networking, right? Isn't that helpful? Well, what does that ever mean, right? You can justify lots of things at that baseline level. And of course, lots of people have come along in the movement, either with some new novel ideas that ultimately maybe don't aren't in the end of the day above the line for a variety of these reasons. It's like, yeah, there's some value, but how much? It's always a comparative thing. There are other people who, for instance, have started to critique some of these sort of tactics and stuff, and they go, well, you shouldn't do that. You should do this. But then again, ask them the same thing. Yeah, but what's the relative value at? And it's harder for them to come up with that. By the way, the funny thing with the Walk of Fame is it turns out it's like really easy to get a star on the Walk of Fame. It just turns out it just costs a hell of a lot of money, but it turns out it's really easy to do.
Yeah, which again surprised us all. But it was, I think it was like 20 or 25,000 to do it. I think, and again, it was just never being able to justify that amount of cost, and for like what it would realistically do for the movement at large, and for her, other than just being a nice gesture.
Yeah. There's a couple things to say about this still, I think. I mean, I know, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I know that after Billboard 2 goes up, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but then there's still some thinking, I think, among some in the movement, like, hey, okay, maybe we ought to put one up outside Del Rey or Marvel or something, right? And I think what we had to, educate folks about as we learn more and more about sort of the nature of our problem being Lucasfilm not greenlighting the licensees to give us more. We realize that the licensees want to continue the EU. We know this for a variety of reasons. Marvel, even the toy merchandise, so they want to see more of this, but ultimately they need the green light from the from Lucasfilm / Disney. And so that's ultimately why this, the billboards went outside Lucasfilm. They're the ones who are in the position to provide the green light. Again, there was some thinking that, well, okay, we've done what we can do with putting billboards there, to the extent that people just wanted to sort of like double down on billboards. It was like, again, put one outside Delray. Doesn't mean anything. They know we're here. They know what they did pre-2014. They'd love to keep doing it. In every case, it turns out we discover they're just waiting on Lucasfilm to sort of, provide sort of the sense of direction. And that's partly why I think Billboard 2, to sort of kind of go back to San Francisco, put something outside Lucasfilm mattered. But it seemed to me, Dylan, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like, to the extent that it was worth going back, it was partly because it was a chance to say, yes, we're still here after all these years. In some sense, Billboard 1 was a chance to say, Episode 7 didn't dissuade us from continuing to fight. We're still here, right? Billboard 2 is about, yes, we're still here this many years on, but also it was a chance to say, here's what we really meant by that billboard. If you were confused before,
right,
what we want is a continuation, not a recanonization or whatever, right? So, and I remember a lot of very robust conversations about what should they actually say, right? And then, so one interesting way around that was 2 billboards this time, right?
Yeah, because we could not only sell it of, we're not just doing the same time. There's a second billboard this time, and then also, again, the timing of it coming out in 2019, or at that point 2020, actually.
Yeah.
Well after when the trilogy was done, because again, we were operating under the impression at the time that if we were going to get Legends to be continued, it wasn't going to happen until the sequel trilogy is done. So this was the timing of, your trilogy is done, we're still here, we would like this, could you please give us more Legends? Yeah,
it was almost kind of like, and I forget at the moment, I just can't recall at the moment exactly what the language was, but again, at the one point I remember discussing making it almost congratulatory, like, Lucasfilm, great, congrats, 3 more films, you did it, right? Now that we're looking for new ideas, right, here we are. But I remember, I think, and this might be getting a little, well, no, I think we're jumping ahead a little bit to 2019, but I sketched out sort of like the messaging around this for the website for kind of a press release, and it was really fun to kind of couch it in terms of, it was almost sort of the early version of this video series we're doing here, to sort of talk about the history of this movement, where we've been since 2014, and how it really has become a force for good, and really wanting to clarify that putting this billboard up is not about sort of trying to, again, like, go on the offensive. It's about saying, here we are, the loyal opposition, still waiting for more Legends. So just give that green light. So again, we might talk about the actual billboard in in our 2020 take. So I think there's one final topic with 2018 that I think you want to dive into. Or did you kind of cover that just in terms of like the overall direction of Twin Suns and the various strategies and tactics and activities? And
I guess the only other thing to say about that is that Twin Suns kind of, this is more of like kind of history, but also kind of just like a general thing as Twin Suns as an entity within the movement of, as we started getting like more and more involved with more and more of the charity aspect, as starting to go into celebration and being a champion of, more Star Wars great for everyone, 2 timelines, 2 continuities, 2 universes, and all that. We kind of had this direction of how much of our efforts should be directed towards the charitable aspects, and how much do we devote to the movement. Like how many, like, well, legally speaking, there is a hard number, a percentage that we have to meet that has to be charitable, actual charitable acts every year. So every time, I forget exactly off the top of my head what that number is, but I know Brian has it written down somewhere. But every time we do like a fundraiser, like the Billboard, for example, we had to make sure that was only X% of what our overall fundraising was for the year, so that we could meet that quota, not just legally, but even just like as in order to maintain our nonprofit status, but also like we at Twin Suns, especially those of us who were a part of it even today, very much enjoy the charitable aspect of it, and all the good that that does. And it's kind of balancing that with the goals of the movement, and how we sort of have to. There's a lot of times we get pitched ideas that we just have to turn down because it's not something that we can do as a legal entity, or it's not something that we have the budget to do. Because again, basically it's more than 50%. I don't know the exact number, but I know it's more than 50% of the money we raise every year has to go to charity. So if we if we want to put another billboard out that costs $5,000, we need to have another fundraiser, a series of fundraisers of at least $5,000 for books, right? And that increases our overhead. That even sometimes there's actually different like tax brackets within like nonprofits, and like the more and more money that we get as a nonprofit, there's actually like a fee for filing taxes. If we hit like the next bracket, it's how the U.S. tax law works, and we're kind of in a sweet spot right now where we basically have to pay nothing. But like the next bracket up is very close to a lot of what we would need to actually do multiple donations, movement-focused donations in a year, and that is very limiting to us. So I guess the long and the short of it is, if you have an idea and you know that it's going to need some like financial backing to it, Twin Suns might not be, or most likely won't be able to back that for you. Unfortunately, that's just how it has to go.
And, maybe that's then a good reason to start your own entity or think of a different way, right? Or, or again, like we've said a number of times, if you've got a good idea, you can do it. There could in theory, right, be multiple Twin Sun-like organizations doing lots of good work in lots of different places all at once, right? But I'm glad you hit on this. It's something we'll probably talk about in our 2019, and it's just worth folks knowing, because you occasionally, right, get people not only with good ideas, but people who seem frustrated with a lot of what's happened in the movement, including with what Twin Suns has done or not done in their opinion, right? And they go, they should be doing X, Y, and Z, and I've got ideas and I've got this. And as you said, it's really, really important to remember, and I'll just put a fine point on this for people who maybe aren't like maybe watching this, who are in North America or in the United States specifically. The Internal Revenue Service, the federal agency that grants tax statuses to nonprofit organizations, has made the Twin Suns Foundation a 501c3 educational charitable nonprofit. It means a variety of very complicated, very complex things, and it puts lots of restrictions on the type of giving. It's also true, by the way, not only in terms of what you are required to do with the money you're given as a 501c3 in order to maintain your charitable tax status, philanthropic tax status. It's also true that there's only so much you can do by way of collecting money from various sorts of outsiders as well. There's lots of different rules about this, and people don't appreciate this as well. Like, if, for instance, if someone came along and said, I'm kind of making this up, the tax law is very complicated, right? But there have been a number of nonprofit 501c3 organizations that, for instance, have done so well with certain sort of contributors that they surpass this threshold that the IRS has for the organization sort of meeting its community standards. That the 501c3 status exists because it's believed a group like Twin Suns does something for, in essence, the community, and it does several things for the community. It educates them about literacy, and it does charitable giving, and so on and so forth, right? But there's a concern that, for instance, if you were getting like all of your money from one person, all of a sudden it looks now like to the IRS like someone's just using it as a tax shelter or something. So there's a long history of nonprofits being created, basically being spun off of other nonprofits, because in order to meet their kind of community giving, they need to do something else to sort of distribute the funds, right? It's just very, very complicated the way this stuff works. And you see it from time to time, fans not entirely clued into that legal, financial, fiscal part of it go, wait a minute, why aren't you doing these things? I've got a great bunch of ideas. The point is, oftentimes, Twin Suns literally cannot do it, legally cannot do it, is at risk of losing its IRS status and worse, right? So yeah, it can't be said enough. It's a very complicated sort of situation that it's in. And
both.
And so, yeah.
both on the legal side and again with the relationships that we currently have. A lot of the relationships we currently have with the 501st, with Lucasfilm and whatnot.
Yeah,
There's a lot of things we can't do that like could potentially jeopardize those relationships that we do depend on to do what we do. So it's we're a victim of our own success in a way, of the
yeah,
ability to donate books and the ability to be a 501c nonprofit and operate like we do, and the ability to attend celebration and to work with the 501st. It gives us a lot of great avenues, and it gives us a lot of benefits, but it also is very limiting in what exactly we can do in regards to movement related efforts.
absolutely. No, that's right. I mean, I was focusing on this the fiscal side of things, but it's true too. And maybe this is something you're alluding to. It's like, look, if someone gets like a stupid idea, like I know what Twin Suns should do. They should organize like a campaign where you like throw water balloons at like Chuck Wendig or something. It's like, well, as an activist strategy, not only is that stupid, but that's the sort of thing that threatens the relationship that, as you say, Twin Suns has, and in a way that the IRS status and the just the ethic that you guys have around keeping sort of your nose clean, so to speak, is so important. Again, to underline this because it's it's the bridge we have officially to fan relations at Lucasfilm, to well respected official Lucasfilm sort of endorsed fan groups like 501st, right? So, again, where there are and have occasionally been these critics of Twin Suns for a variety of and sometimes bizarre cases, looking a gift horse in the mouth. I mean, Twin Suns has really become sort of the kind of a professional sort of entry point into conversations with the Lucasfilm, with the organization we're ultimately in the end looking to actually work with to
Mhm.
continue legends, right? So um yeah, well, should we jump into 2019?
Yeah,
Lot to talk about here, a lot of ups, a lot of downs.
yeah,
um
a lot of both actually.
a
Really
lot
runs
of
the
both.
gambit.
Boy, it's crazy. I mean, 2019 just whew, I mean, so much happened. It's a banner year for a lot of reasons. I guess let's talk about Celebration Chicago, and I think that'll relate then to the next item on the list. That'll be a good segue into that.
Mhm.
So, Celebration Chicago, um, in 2019, the previous celebration had been in 2017 Orlando. We talked about that in our last video. It's where I got to meet you in person for the first time. 2019, Twin Suns is back, and once again, sort of invited to be part of the show, part of the family. The one thing I'll say, you probably got a lot more to say as someone who was sort of manning that booth the whole time. One thing I have to say about 2019, as opposed to 2017, is that it really felt like the EU was back in a bigger way at 2019 in terms of not necessarily in terms of representation and programming at Celebration, but in terms of just the exhibition hall and the floor, the
Mhm.
number of costumes, the number of booths, yours included. It just felt like the EU was somehow elevated again in a way that in 2017 it frankly felt like if you guys weren't there and a few of us fans weren't there, I don't know what representation the EU was going to get. But 2019,
Yeah,
it felt like the scales were shifting, and that was very positive.
yeah. I definitely had that feeling as well. Um, just because not only that, but because this being the second time we had been out there, more people knew about us. More people were able to like actually come out and like see us, not just from like people visiting us at the booth, but like the team at Twin Suns had expanded, so we had even more volunteers that could actually come out and like work the booth with us. A lot of different people. Some people from the original
Right.
couldn't make it, but others were able to. Uh, a lot more presence at the booth. I think we had at one point like 7 or 8 people uh, at the booth at once, meeting a lot of people as well. That like I remember. I think that's when I met Evan. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
he was there. He was like a
Yep.
mainstay of it. I remember uh Amelia, who was there, she was really great at like venturing out into like the con and like getting pictures of like all the EU cosplayers. And if
Hmm.
you go to the Twin Suns Facebook page, most of our photos are just from Celebration Chicago, and all the people, all the cosplay EU cosplayers she was able to flag down and get photos of, just to
Hmm.
really show the support that we were out there this wasn't just 5 or 6 people with like with armbands with a with an orange stripe of tape on them. This wasn't just like 6 people in a booth with like uh, this was like a convention wide own little niche within the convention that was going around, and we brought back the raffles and the little fetch quest to get us books so we can donate it to the hospital, uh, where we started getting uh, people donating the Delray sampler to us. That was when someone donated
Yes.
Aftermath to us.
Yeah.
We actually started to get a lot of canon books donated as well, which we knew was going to happen. We were fine with, and also networking, because that was
Mhm.
like I said, we had several authors walk by the booth and stream. I remember a couple times John Jackson Miller dropped by, and we got some pretty good interviews with him about things that he wanted to do and
Mm.
his experience with writing. And again, like with Celebration Orlando, our entire live stream, we live streamed the whole thing. It's all on
Mhm.
YouTube on the Twin Suns YouTube channel. If you missed it and want to go back and revisit it's all there. You can kind of live through the convention
Yeah,
vicariously through us.
that's right. You can see all the costumers, see those interviews, see those other fans. Um, I remember you and I think early on before the floor actually opened up, we got a chance to talk with Dave Dorman,
Hmm.
the legendary EU artist, and talk to him about something that's very relevant this week. This won't be very evergreen for people who watch this years from now, but we talked to him about Lightsider, and because he was sort of commissioned to do the art for what was going to be a proposed Tom Veitch novella, sort of a follow up to Dark Empire, situated between Dark Empire 1 and Dark Empire 2. Tom Veitch ultimately sort of pulled out of the project for a variety of reasons, wanted to sort of slightly de-Star Warsify it and sort of do it something sort of independent ultimately. But it existed as this lost bit of EU, which this week has finally, through a variety of reasons, um, been made public. So,
Right.
and it's one of those awkward things where I can now finally admit admit publicly, now that it's out, that I've had it for years. I've had a copy for years, and Dylan, I know you've read it. Although I think I might have shared it with you. I think you got a unique opportunity to read it when you visited Matt Wilkins, right? Or was that
Uh,
Jeremy?
that Jeremy got to read it. I
Jeremy
didn't.
got to read it.
So I didn't want to read it at the time. I've always, because I've known about it too, but I was always waiting for it to come out, like to like legitimately actually like come out and be public, and we could actually talk
Right,
about it. That's when I
right.
really wanted to enjoy it, because I wanted to enjoy it with everyone else. I did end up reading it anyway earlier this year when I got it from the uh the grapevine, I guess.
Yeah,
the
the
um
grapevine. Yeah. And by the way, I'll still. What's interesting is now, even though it's out there, and I will honor the word of the person who gave it to me many years ago. I will never reveal this. I will never reveal my source. But suffice it to say, some of us had it, and it's weird now that it's public. So, and I'm glad it's
yeah.
public because it's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story. Important contribution to the EU. But in any event, it was really funny talking to Dave Dorman about that too, and not being able to talk to him about how,
Hmm.
yes, I knew everything about this story. But anyway, that was a lot of fun. There was an announcement, and a formal announcement at. Well, you know what? Shoot, I mean, um, before we get to 108, for anyone who's wondering when we're going to talk about that, let me just say one other thing about something at Celebration that I noticed, and it ties into something very important that a commenter, I think, on the last video said that he noticed we've missed, and we didn't miss it. We sort of wanted to wait a little bit to talk about this. It's a story that could really fit anywhere in any one of our videos in any year. It's a story that we could even be telling about today in 2022, and it's SWTOR. It's Star Wars: The Old Republic, and the essential critical role it's played all these years later, post 2014, in being the one thing that is ongoing that is actually officially continuing the Star Wars EU Legend storyline. We just got another expansion this year. I forget exactly how many there have been, but there have been expansions.
Hmm.
There have been occasional, very sort of short stories related to it. Um, I think in one instance, we even had Zahn come back and contribute some background lore, and so it's the reason why it's an interesting segue off 2019 celebration is one of the things that made 2019 so EU-rific to me compared to 2017 at celebration is that there were not just groups like Twin Suns, but there were a couple of very important official Star Wars: The Old Republic booths, some fan groups and some booths. There had even been a big event, I think the night before it started, which was, I think, promoting the Onslaught, which was with the expansion of 2019.
Right.
I think I've done a video about, like, I've got the Onslaught T-shirt and everything else that came off of that. But what was really interesting was, at least in my anecdotal experience, every single person I talked to at those booths, all the admins, all the fans hanging around, every one of them was incredibly conscious and excited about their role in their game being the thing that's continuing the EU. So I think for years there's been sort of this sense, sort of this conventional wisdom that, well, the Old Republic is this unique thing. It kind of sits off to the side.
Yeah.
There's the EU, there's the new canon, but it's this game. And many people, I think, early on to post 2014 thought, look, that's going to get canonized anyway. Never did. And Pablo has been so clear about this over the years. It is part of EU storytelling, right? It's not canonized. But what was so cool was, sure, he could say that, we could understand it intellectually, but ultimately, did the gamers really feel that? Or aren't they just gamers primarily, and sort of Star Wars fans second, who just happen to be playing this Old Republic game? No, the guys and gals at this convention in these booths, costuming, playing, advocating, officially part of the fan community, they get it. They are EU fans, and they love that their game is the one thing continuing the EU.
And not only that, but we kind of, I think we maybe mentioned this in passing, but for a lot of those early years, the Old Republic was the only new EU content that we were consistently getting, either through the expansions or the short stories that were coming out on their website. And unfortunately, it's kind of a little footnote that we all, like, kind of maybe took for granted. It's like, yeah, we're getting the Old Republic story still. There's that one little victory that every few months or so a new short story would come up, and every few years a new expansion would come out, which would expand the lore of that era. But it was just so nice to see. Again, it felt like the EU movement really was or the EU presence at Celebration Chicago was really just a two-front thing, where it was, you could be at the Twin Suns booth, or you could be at this SWTOR booth, and it was so great, just having another bastion or place that people could congregate and talk about the EU that wasn't just the Twin Suns booth.
Exactly. It was great, and I remember correctly. First of all, there were a couple of booths that seemed to be focused on SWTOR. I think because a couple were independent fan groups, but there was the main thing. If I remember correctly, it wasn't that far from Twin Suns, right?
Yeah, it was the same. It was down the same aisle. Yeah, we were at. There was an aisle. We were at one end of the aisle, and they were at the other end of the aisle. So it's like the two corners of this aisle was like.
It was kind of like the EU alley, right?
Yeah.
You get to
There was like a massage booth right across from us. We're like.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, these conventions get crazy. Yeah. Well, okay.
Actually,
so
one more thing about Chicago.
Yeah.
We don't have it on here, but it's kind of tertiarily related to the EU. This was when Celebration Chicago was when Project Luminous was first announced, which for a good 2 years, there was a lot of speculation all around of what it could possibly be. From some of the more hopeful ones were maybe this is the Legends continuation, because the timing is right. A lot of people thought Project Luminous, it's a quote, it's like a somewhat quote from Empire Strikes Back. It's coming out in 2020, which is the 40 years, so maybe it's Empire Strike Back related. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that it's High Republic. It was just their little code name that they came up for the High Republic. But kind of a small thing, but it at least for the next 2 years would be a thing in the back of the mind of everyone, of what is this Project Luminous thing that's coming? What could it be, and is it good or bad news for what we're trying to accomplish?
Right. By the way, you're getting a little glitchy. I don't know if there's
like
another browser or something you've opened up, but I think that all came through. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I know we talked a bit about that earlier this week, and I just think, yeah, ultimately it ends up being about the High Republic against something wholly situated in the new canon. I don't follow the new canon. I'm glad that there are folks who are both EU fans and new canon fans. That's great. You get more content. Not for me, and that's fine. But yeah, I just remember thinking, in retrospect, what horrible marketing. Boy, they
Mhm.
really set us up for something big. And I think that what was so striking to me about that Empire Strikes Back quote about luminous beings, there was something, the way they worded it, it was something like, "Oh, we're these luminous beings, dot 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 until now." Remember that? There was something about the
Mhm.
until now. So you got this sense that, wow, even from this side of the continuities, I'm not following the new stuff, but wow, are they going to do something really groundbreaking? Are they going to fundamentally change what the nature of the force? I mean, who knows what this is going to be? And ultimately, it turns out all this mystical marketing lingo. We're just setting up some adventures that take place a couple hundred years before the films. That's it. An- Another one of these. sorry to sound bitter and critical, but another one of these, like, in a long line of post 2014 Lucasfilm sort of like messaging, just like complete fails. I mean,
Mhm.
that really begins with the ultimate messaging in 2014 about decanonization. I still can't believe how ham-fisted it all was. It
Right.
seemed like Project Luminous was one of those things that I think it really teed up not just us, but I imagine even new canon fans who, in the end of the day, maybe they like the High Republic, but we're probably expecting something completely different, right, in every sort of way. But speaking of announcements, there was
Yep.
another. I don't know if it was an announcement per se, but they certainly was something that was part of the the like the new publishing initiative panel, and obviously it was Marvel 108, Star Wars Marvel 108. This is something that I think as early as February of 2019. Had been rumored. Folks on Reddit and everywhere else were talking about
Mhm.
this, and I think there was some reason to be skeptical about, okay, is this true? And if it's true, is this something this is going to be really our first test of
Mhm.
honest to goodness, new post 2014 commissioned original EU work set in the original continuity. Um, but is this going to be something that's going to sort of blend the canons, right? Which is, again, not something we want. We don't want continuation. We want continuation, not integration.
Right.
What's this going to be? And then not that long after that, it was officially announced that no, this will in fact be wholly situated inside the old
Mhm.
continuity. And we come to learn later that, yeah, this is because this is something that Marvel editors really wanted and had been pushing for a very long time up to this point. And that I think the
Yeah.
reason we got it then, which I think surprised everyone, because what did we always said, and we've already alluded to it in this video, we thought we would always have to at least wait through 2019 with the completion of the sequel trilogy before there would be anything potentially competing with, like, the new canon. But I think I think it was it Marvel's anniversary that sort of
Yeah.
provided this opportunity, I think, for Lucasfilm to sort of very begrudgingly say, okay, here's the green light. I don't want to jump ahead just to the bitter part, but one thing that we sort of were able to put together after the fact is that this was a project that was greenlit begrudgingly by Lucasfilm, lovingly and persistently demanded by Marvel, the licensee, but was something that Lucasfilm, we learned this in retrospect, and I don't want to reveal sources, but here's the facts. Lucasfilm greenlit it and agreed to it, but also agreed they weren't going to do anything to market it.
Mhm.
And this leads to some sort of confusion and a bit of gaslighting by some of the of the canon story group later on social media, who claimed, among other things, that it was one of that it was highly promoted, right? Well, it was promoted by us, the fans,
Yeah.
right, who have effectively become the only thing marketing the EU now. But no, I mean, it received virtually nothing.
Yeah.
We got one image of it at Celebration,
Yep.
we got one advertisement of it in Marvel previews, and that's it.
Yep. It was so well, as I said many times, it was so well advertised that my local comic shop, when I went in to get it, didn't even know that they had it on their shelf.
Right, right.
And it also came out when it did came out, because it was a continuation of the story in issue 50. So they actually re-released not only issue 107 around the same time, but they also re-released issue 50 um, to kind of go along. And I remember some people bought some comic stores had like a 3 comic bundle, I think, where you could get like all 3 of the issues at the same time. I saw that at one of the comic stores, comic shops I went to.
Well, that's neat. That's neat. Well, it was, yeah. So putting aside some of the bitter stuff about it, what we learned about the inside after that, I got to tell you, this was one of the most exciting days in certainly my post 2014 EU life. I felt a bit going into the comic shop that day, which by the way is something I hadn't done in a while, because why would I be going to the comic shop? I
Mhm.
wasn't picking up EU stories anymore. Going into a comic shop, seeing that Legends banner, being able to buy that thing, being able to read a new EU story was so unbelievably exciting to me. Matt Wilkins and I talk about how, he called me, I think, as he was on his way home from the comic shop, and we were just like little kids again. And I told him, I said, I haven't read it yet. I really want to savor this, right? And I remember, precisely to your point, in addition, by the way, to buying the other 7 variants, because I think in the end there were 7 or 8 different covers,
Yeah,
right?
there were 7 variants. 5 came out the first day, and then 2 came out like a couple weeks later.
That's right, and I always consider there was an 8th one, and partially just for silly reasons, because Midtown Comics in New York had they had a signed version of one of them that you could also buy. So in my mind, it's always 8, so because I have that too.
Mhm.
But it was so unbelievably excited, and I did what you said. I bought the sort of like the reprint of issue 50 and 107, and I said, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read these again, get caught up on this, and then I'll read. And the most amazing thing happened. I read through them, and I was done. I just picked up 108, started flipping through it. I got a couple of pages in, and I stopped myself. I didn't even realize I'd started 108. It was so seamless, in my opinion. And
Mhm.
to me, and I loved 108. There were some fans that had mixed opinions. There's always going to be, it's art at the end of the day. There's always going to be subjective views about it. But to me, it answered any questions and any fears that anyone had ever had about, well, what if they continue the EU, even in a small way like Marvel 108? Is it going to be a mess? Are they going to respect the continuity? Is it going to be agenda driven? Whatever people's pet issue is, right? That's preventing them from wanting more EU from modern Lucasfilm. It quelled any of those concerns, in my opinion. It just went to show that the licensees ultimately are the ones that are driving this. They want
Mhm.
to continue to tell the stories they got to tell pre 2014. They picked some authors who understood it, who you could tell were working in very subtle nods to continuity,
And who are
um,
fans of it as well, and
and
cared
who
about
were
it as much as
fans.
we did.
Yes, yes, and so I just had just the most delightful time with that, and then and the really nice thing too was we were able to do the analysis, look at Comicron, which is the great comic resource actually run by EU author John Jackson Miller, and discovered that I think with one exception, it was that one issue, which got no marketing basically from Lucasfilm, outsold almost every other new canon comic, and
In the
that was a
month.
really
Yeah.
tremendous success.
Yeah, especially because it was monthly sales that had happened, and it had come out so late in the month. And then, of course, the
Yeah.
spoil sports were quick to point out, well, it had 5 and later 7 variant covers. But we didn't talk about this because it wasn't relevant. But I remember in 2015 when Marvel issue 1 came out, the first of the comics, it also had like 50 plus variant covers
It had
and sold
100. Dylan, it had
100.
100.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I wasn't aware of how. I knew it was obscene how many comic
Obscene. Yeah.
variants it had, but again, it's like, the hypocrisy of, oh, this one sold really well. It broke all sorts of records. Yeah, because it had 100. Oh, we did really well. Yeah, but you had like, it's the same argument. Like, you see the argument when it's on when it goes for you, but when it's against you, you just kind of ignore it.
Right. Right. Yeah. It was a shame. It was an interesting moment though, I think, in the context of the fandom. I mean, there was definitely it provided a small window into what might happen into a possible future where we do get a full continuation of the EU. One thing that I've always said, I think we have to be honest about, is in the way that pre 2014, many of us as Star Wars and EU fans got to dabble. Some of us followed everything. Some of us probably occasionally liked this era or that era. Maybe some people were just Old Republic fans. Some people were just post Jedi EU fans. People had lots of different opinions. There was a certain thing that happened post 2014 where I think fan opinion about the EU got a little defensive, right? And we kind of all liked everything, and it became perfect, and but one thing I always argued was, well, if we ever got it back, well, naturally the fandom would kind of splinter again the way that all fandoms do. You're just free to sort of not have to be super defensive about every single part of it, right? Whereas now we're sort of under attack. But the interesting thing about this one comic issue being released, all of a sudden you started to see a little bit of fracturing to some degree, right? People arguing like, well, sure, I want a continuation of the EU, but I didn't want this one. So we found ourselves now fighting a new sort of internal battle about, look, like we've said for 5 years now, literally, that we need to prove to them that we want this. They're giving us a chance, make it a bestseller. And we did. Arguably, could it have sold more? I guess in theory, yeah, right. But then again, you look at the comics market in general. Comics don't sell at all. I mean,
Right.
interestingly, when I looked at the numbers, I went back and started comparing it to some random pre-2014 comic sales. It was actually not only outselling new canon comics in 2019, it was outselling EU comics pre-2014 in many cases as well, which I think is really interesting, which just goes to show how much the EU fandom had actually grown post 2014. But again, you had some fans, I think, sort of prejudging it. Fans who they didn't have it in hand, saying there's no way it's going to be good, or it's not the story I want, or I wanted Force Unleashed 3, I didn't want Marvel 108. It's about proving that we had to start somewhere. We need something, right? And so that was I'll be honest, that was a little disconcerting, right? But again, ultimately, enough of us came out, and I think proved that we're still here, and we're looking to put our money where our fandom is. I have to come back to something I alluded to before, because it's something I've talked about a number of times since, and just to sort of put it on record. One really unfortunate experience I had that put the biggest wet blanket on my excitement for Star Wars I'd probably ever felt was as soon as that thing came out and I read it, I started connecting with Matthew Rosenberg, the main writer, on Twitter. He's very responsive. And I thanked him profusely and everyone involved with the decision to greenlight this, to put this together, to write this, to illustrate this, to edit this, right, to produce this, to distribute it, et cetera, et cetera. And, he was very gracious. We went back and forth. Really, really great. And then somehow Matt Martin from the Story Group, the guy with the reputation for being super accessible and super lovely, who I would have said that about myself up till then, somehow got into the thread, basically hijacked it, on a thread with Matthew Rosenberg, the main writer of a Star Wars comic, started telling him and all of us about how ultimately it really wasn't that big of a success, not that big of a deal, not that big of a thing, nothing to really get that excited about. A Story Group member, who, by the way, in the context of this thread is also arguing that it was highly promoted, which it wasn't, is basically going out of his way to say, we did all these things for this, but it was basically just a big mess. And it was sort of a failure. It did nothing to advance your cause. You guys didn't come out in force. It wasn't even that great of a story. He had to start backtracking because I think he realized, oh my gosh, I'm saying all of this on a thread with the writer, someone we're supposed to support, someone who I'm claiming our company is actually promoting the work of, right? I think it was the first time. I mean, in the way that we talked about, there was this group of people who stuck through Force Awakens and Last Jedi, but then gave up after Last Jedi. I had somehow fought all the way through decanonization, discontinuation, all the way through to 2019. That was finally the thing that broke me a little bit. And that was the thing that made me feel like, just having greenlit the continuation, they're now here to sort of tell us, like, don't get too excited, don't be happy. It's not what you think it is. I almost walked away because I'm realizing now I really do know what these people are talking about. These other angry fans who I don't want to identify with, who I don't identify with. Again, to be an EU fan 2019 was no longer to be angry, it was to be the opposition. All of a sudden now I'm being told in the thread with an EU author now that we should all basically just take our excitement, pack it up, and go home. That was a really low moment for me, and I think for a lot of people on that thread. And I've come to learn later that a lot of people saw that thread and I think had similarly pretty sort of bitter, disappointed reactions. So yeah, shame on the Story Group members for doing that. That was a real bummer, and it's one of those reasons why 2019 for me is such a period of high. One of the reasons why it's such a period of lows. One of the reasons why I look back with mixed views about 108 ultimately, because It meant so much to me, and I love the story, and I read it so many times since, and I even later picked up the trade paperback it was collected in Forever Crimson. But man, what Matt Martin did to us, I don't know that I can forgive.
Yeah.
It's a real bummer. Anyway, sorry for monologuing, but needed to be
No
said.
worries. Now into, well, we got into all the good things. Now we're on to the bad. The first one, just an absolutely infuriating thing. Folks, 2019 was the year that Kathleen Kennedy said, "We don't have the books. We don't have the books, the comics, or
The source
whatever,
material.
the source material." And like, again, from a Legends standpoint, we don't really care what's happening within the new movies, but that was
Right.
such a slap to the face of like, what, like, yeah, you don't have these because you threw it all out. Like, you could have, but like, you were the ones. They're complaining about an issue that they created essentially for themselves.
Yeah. It was crazy. It's one of those. It's again one of those quotes. It's you kind of can't believe that's what you heard them
Mhm.
say, right? Just it's almost even hard to know what to comment on beyond just how absurd it is on its face. No source material. Well, then why did you in 2014 say the old source material is no longer worth
Right.
covering? Baffling, absolutely baffling. And another one of those, one step forward with 108 and other things, and 3,000 steps back, where you're just like, how much further can they alienate us? How much further can they act as if we're not here? It's crazy. Like, what are we in the twilight zone all of a sudden? So yeah. Well, I think the last big topic and the the biggest low I think for 2019 is Dylan. I have to turn some of this over to you to sort of frame because it's just it's just it's too personal. It's but what do we call this? We call
The what was the stream they did, the fall of Matt Wilkins, or what was
right.
it?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Um, I think I've said this story before of how in my opinion it all began. Um, we kind of haven't really talked about them directly in this. We kind of just kind of alluded to, but amongst the many that had come out against Disney in the wake of The Last Jedi was this quasi kind of group that roughly went by the Fandom Menace, which
Hmm.
uh, has a little bit of overlap within the EU movement, kind of similar to like the Clone. Well, not exactly similar to the Clone Wars, but it had some overlap, but is definitely its own distinct entity with some back and forth and
Well,
some people.
to be clear, right? What you mean by that is like that. Of course, there are individuals who
Yeah,
would identify sort of simultaneously. Yes, I'm an EU movement here, and also I use this hashtag fandom menace, right? Yeah,
right. But more or less are after have completely different goals and objectives, are after two different things. It just so happens that there are some people who are a part of both communities that want both of the goals to happen, right? And it all started, I think, with a stream of one of them, one of the more prolific members of like the Phantom Menace, where some people that would eventually become a part of this group that would eventually break off uh, from the EU movement were basically being made fun of by by the streamer that was a part of the Fandom Menace, and it was
right.
a big misconception. I remember like getting sent this video by someone's like, "Look, the Fandom Menace hates the movement, but and the EU." But it's like it wasn't that they were like hating on the EU or the movement. They were just they were making fun of the EU or the movement. They were just making fun of like the one or two people in chat that were saying stupid things, and not really stupid things, but just like not explaining their points well enough and like coming across of like of like getting their point across. Like, for example, in fact, the video I remember was subtitled many times because they would say like, "Oh, you don't even like support Clone Wars, or like you haven't even seen Clone Wars or something like that. And what they mean by Clone Wars is the Tartakovsky micro series, right? But they just say you haven't seen Clone Wars, and they're just like, of course I've seen Clone Wars, thinking they're talking about TCW, and then making fun of them for that. And that sort of became a narrative that, oh, the Phantom Menace hates the EU movement, and that was a thing that kind of perpetuated in some people's minds for several months, without really boiling over, until Matt in particular started doing streams with Ryan Kinnell, and then it all just hit the fan.
Yeah. What's so tricky about this is, and we talked about this before we hit the record button, is we could deconstruct this and relitigate this and live through this again. Wouldn't want to, but it could go. We could talk about this for hours. And it's tricky because it's like, on the one hand, we've already gotten into some like really sort of nerdy weeds about this, and people might be looking at this like, what? Wait, what? If you hadn't seen those videos you're referring to, like some people already watching this might be like, wait, what? What is this about? I'm not really sure. It's one of those things where I don't think anyone profits from us going into too much further detail about how this all started. I think it's enough to say that, like, yeah, ultimately there was a perception by a small group of fans in the movement that other elements of the movement were harming the movement, right? I mean, and there becomes basically this huge sort of civil war now within the fandom EU movement, largely on YouTube, right? And with really deadly serious consequences. I mean, and to kind of jump ahead, I mean, this is something that led to like almost like criminal, slanderous, libelous accusations against the Twin Sons Foundation, against many fans collectively. I got death threats. I got called sexist, racist, and Nazi. Astounding things, largely for the crime of having appeared on videos on a panel, right, with other people who were deemed, inappropriate to sort of be in association with EU members because of a particular view about this thing called the Phantom Menace. The funny thing was, many of us said till we were blue in the face, we're not Phantom Menace. Frankly, I spent most of 2018 even trying to figure out what the Phantom Menace was. Was it even a movement? Did it have an objective? Did it have an aim? I think to me, it sort of felt like a long line of like largely exclusive online communities like Gamergate and Comicsgate that just was trying to start another culture war. Again, I'm in this for the EU, to the extent that there are individuals who use the hashtag the Phantom Menace who want to talk about the EU. Great, right? That's all that really sort of mattered. I have no idea what the Phantom Menace is, to the extent that I even consume anyone else's content on YouTube. If someone over there wanted to talk about the EU in the early days, maybe that was fine. The second they want to start talking about Captain Marvel, I couldn't care less, right? I don't need to know other people's opinion to know what I think about movies I watch. I certainly don't care about other people's opinions about like Brie Larson as an actress. I want to talk about the expanding universe. But there was just sort of a perception that these two quote unquote movements just could not exist. And to do so would harm the EU fandom and the EU movement. And so again, to the extent that some of us were perceived to be collaborating by virtue of simply sort of appearing on various videos as part of a discussion panel, we were in some sense doing them the greatest harm, and ultimately, in their opinion, sort of responsible for sort of doing all these horrible things to the movement. I sort of tried to sketch out sort of like kind of like the rough timeline. I'm just going to run through this here, and just to kind of, it's kind of just a framework, and we can kind of fill in the gaps if we need, or at the minimum, just put them out there for just like the broad kind of roadmap to how we got from there to sort of here. I think it corresponds with a couple of things. I think, and this is a bit of a separate but related sort of just quick digression. By 2019, we're talking 5 years after the decanonization. Now, when you think demographically, sociologically, when you think in terms of generations, you think anything from 10 to 25 years. But when I think you think about lots of the cultural movements, social movements, online communities, when you think about how much more quickly ideas disperse, people come in, they come out, they get burned out, they move in, they move out. I think generations are much shorter. And I think just depends, right? I mean, I think in any fandom, there's different sorts of generations, and they're demarked by different sorts of things. But I think an interesting thing about the EU fandom was by 2019, there's a whole new group of people who are sort of coming sort of online, so to speak, um, coming aboard the EU fandom for any variety of reasons. Maybe it's because in 2014, they were a little too young. Maybe they don't remember. Maybe they don't remember what it was like to have the EU. You know, they're coming to it later. Just for a variety of reasons. There's a new generation of fans who are excited to learn more about the EU, but who are just being introduced to the fandom and the movement within the fandom, right? So there's this new generation sort of coming online to join the movement. And I think the key there, in my opinion, and this is just my observation, but I think because of the way they came aboard later, um, they, and I didn't know how to put this, but in some sense, they join a movement rather than a fandom. You know, and I think partially because in a lot of cases they weren't fans pre-2014. Again, they were maybe younger or something, right? And they didn't really understand what was lost and why we were fighting. They sort of showed up and there was already this infrastructure in place. So they joined, I think it's an important distinction, a movement rather than a fandom that needed a movement to achieve a certain aims. And I think through a lot of the social media fragmentation I talked about at the very beginning, I think they don't sort of see the bigger picture. I think a number of these newer fans at the time, I think they lack sort of a certain situational awareness about the EU fandom and the EU movement and everything that it accomplished. Is its ups, its downs, every other place it existed and every other social media platform, right? There was just a lot of fragmentation, a lot of lack of sort of broader context, broader awareness. And ultimately, it seemed like what a lot of these fans wanted to do is, instead of do what they could to convince Lucasfilm to continue Legends, their objective almost seemed to be, well, let's perfect the movement, right? And that's what I mean about them joining a movement rather than a fandom that needed a movement to continue Legends. Their objective was, let's shape the movement. They wanted to make the movement, in some sense, the thing to save and not the expanded universe, right? There was this twisted thing where almost like the strategies and tactics, the movement to achieve the objective of more EU had been swapped out. So their objective was the strategy, their objective were the tactics. And I think that had some unfortunate consequences. And I think, again, because it's now 2019, they're like thinking, wait a minute, it's been 5 years since 2014, something that they're just sort of learning about, right? And they go, whoa, this is horrible. Why don't we have anything? Not knowing, because they don't have the situational awareness in the history of where we've been since 2014, not knowing that we'd always said, we're going to have to wait this out till 2019. They start getting impatient, and they're not willing to wait past 2019, right? And then I think that this starts to lead to some myths, and I think that immediately, in very quick succession, they start to put together, okay, I'm new to this, I'm joining this movement, we've got to save this movement. If we don't save the movement, we're never going to get EU, right? They start looking around, they go, well, we haven't gotten it yet. What must be the problem? It must be that this movement and people we perceive to be the leaders of it, they're doing wrong things, they're holding us back. There's this myth that emerges about what they call the old guard, people like us, right? Anyone who apparently was like born of a certain, a certain year or something, right? Anybody who basically been around is an EU fan. They were the old guard. They believe that they destroyed the chances of getting more EU because of all these wrong strategies, these wrong tactics. They just assumed that whatever they thought we were doing must have been wrong, again, logically in their opinion, because we didn't have more EU yet, right? It starts feeding into weird myths too that we alluded to in our 2014 video about there was this really weird sense back then, both in the early days and then even again in this resurgence, this weird sort of movement in 2019, that unless you read both the new canon and the old canon, Lucasfilm isn't going to give us more. Do you remember that? All of a sudden they started sort of making these weird claims, like, again, and I think largely because it was just one of these notions that, like, well, they're like, hey, to the extent they perceived us just focusing on the EU, they just thought, well, that's one tactic, let's do a different tactic. They were just so obsessed with there needed to be one tactic. And that's why I've always said, let a thousand flowers bloom, right? And the funny thing was, it was like, they specifically started saying things like dual canon. They thought, we need to retire the EU fandom, the EU movement. We need to start what they called a dual canon movement. And what was so ironic was, it just proved what little situational awareness they had. Hadn't they been paying attention to our messaging the whole time? We'd always said 2 canons, twin suns, continuation, not integration, continuation along a parallel path to the new canon. It was always the point. If you want to follow both, follow both. If you want to follow EU, here's an EU fandom. But what we're going to do, because we want more Star Wars for everyone, right? Which is something we've been saying forever. We want to continue the old along the new, right? But again, they sort of thought that they had finally perfected the movement, and if you perfect the messaging, you perfect, the thing. And it kind of reminds me of that line from 1984 where they talk about when the revolution is successful, thought will come from here, the Adam's apple, rather than here, right? And ultimately, it's like they just kind of thought, if you get the tactics right, everything else will sort of logically follow. And again, as I sort of alluded to, they kind of then up the ante by sort of arguing that any older fans and again, the slew of slime that was thrown at us. I've got emails that argue we're racist, and I don't know why they thought that, because again, not to dox any of us, right? But again, I'll never forget the twin. I was on the receiving end along with some Twin Sons folks.
Yep.
It was amazing. It was specifically just to us. It wasn't to Matt. It was to me and the Twin Sons folks. And I forget the reasoning, but somehow we were racist because I don't know why. I hate to break it to this person. And again, not to dox the four of us. It was me, you, Brian, and Amelia. Not to dox personal information about this, but I know I know a name like Christopher Nelson sounds pretty Anglo. Dylan may look like a little white guy. We're all 31 flavors here, okay? I hate to break it to them, right? You know what I mean? How embarrassing for them, right? To assume that, whatever. Not to, it was just, you couldn't think of a more laughable sort of charge. And they didn't even have any reason. They just thought it was an inflammatory thing to say about us.
Yeah. And well, the reason that they sent that was because part of their accusations was that Matt specifically was profiting off of various Twin Sons fundraisers, which, again, going back to the legal issues I talked about earlier, is a huge no-no when it comes to 501(c)s. So we came out very strongly and said, no, that's not what's happening at all. In fact, those of us at Twin Sons, because we're not making any money of this. It's not any of our full-time jobs. We all have jobs. We all have lives. We do Twin Sons on our own time, and a lot of times at our own cost, as a lot of what goes into keeping the doors open at Twin Sons is just a lot of us like putting money into Twin Sons, not just in keeping the website afloat, but when we go out to Celebration, those fundraisers, they don't cover our plane tickets. They don't cover they don't cover the hotels or Airbnbs we stay at. They don't cover the food while we're there. They don't cover the time off we have to take from work. That's all on the members. We basically pay to run Twin Sons. So those accusations that we were making money off of this was bad not only from the legal standpoint that we could lose our 501(c)(3) status, or we could lose relationships with hospitals with the 501st and whatnot, but also just like insulting just on our character. And we came out and said very adamantly, it's like that we're documenting these accusations, and if it becomes necessary, we will take legal action if something happens. And then the email was, hey, you can't take legal action because some of the people who are saying these things are of these demographics or whatnot. And it's like, what?
Yes.
It's not, it wasn't, again, to iterate, it wasn't a threat of legal action. We genuinely did not want to have to resort to suing anyone, right? Because that's just a bad look anywhere. We were basically just preparing for the worst because we didn't know what was going to happen if those accusations got out, again, to the IRS, again, to the hospitals we'd worked with, or the 501st. If we ever got into a situation where we contacted a hospital to do a donation and they said, no, you're that charity that steals money from people and stuff, it's that, we were just trying to prepare ourselves for the worst. And they took that as a threat, which I guess it technically was, but it really wasn't meant in that way. And then decided to play the race card for lack of a better term.
Yeah, right. It was another one of these Twilight Zone moments. There were a lot of Twilight Zone moments in 2019 for a lot of reasons. This was maybe the most nightmarish of them all. Again, it was just almost cartoonish stuff at times. Again, that email I will never forget. And but yeah, I mean, again, it needs to be said. I mean, because it's the sort of thing that every once in a while, I'll still hear people talk about. I mean, this many years later is something that did have some ripple effects. Now, ultimately, interestingly, some of the people involved in this seem to have kind of gone away. In fact, I think the prime instigator seemed to have gone away. And I should be totally fair in the interest of amity. I actually reached out to the person in 2020 just to try and say that seemed like the absolute worst of online fandom, whatever. Like, let's just move on. And we just, we the last time I interacted with them 2 years ago, we just kind of decided, let's just, you know what I mean, go our separate ways. One of the guys, interestingly, is sort of still around and does occasionally do Star Wars reviews, and is someone who years before actually was a really interesting, engaged member of the EU fandom, an early advocate of the first Billboard, for instance, someone who was an occasional guest on the Legends podcast, which we alluded to back in 2014, someone who I was very sad to see sort of take such a bizarre turn. And again, someone who since then, I've just tried my best just to sort of, move on from, and I, again, the same way, interact with them briefly enough just to sort of say, let's just agree to disagree, right? But you still hear about this occasionally, and there was someone else involved in this who again, to their credit, has tried to sort of like rehabilitate their role in the greater EU fandom, and is wants to be a positive force in the fandom, and good for them. I mean, it's still hard to see them rolling around, knowing what they did a couple of years ago, and sort of wondering, do they appreciate just how potentially libelous and slanderous what they and their sort of cohort were arguing, and the risk that they put not just this fandom, but much more importantly, individuals and organizations and charitable activities, into like an uncertain sort of position. Just crazy, just baffling. And again, the fact that in 2014, the EU fandom that needed a movement to protect itself from that overnight sort of changing of the guard, with new canon fans coming after many of us with death threats in this back in the day. We talked about this in 2014. The fact that 5 years later, we now found ourselves receiving the same type of hate from our own fans, right? From our own sort of EU brethren, was astonishing. And again, so for me, 2019, both personally and in terms of the movement, will always be one of the greatest highs with Marvel 108. And again, the anecdotal successes at Celebration and the role that SWTOR played and continues to play. And then there was this. And the way that it sort of all transpired by the end of the year meant that, like, yeah, we really ended 2019 at a really tough spot. And then, of course, the next year COVID happens. And so it was just the perfect prelude to just a crappy couple of years, right? But again, it still comes up. But the interesting thing is that, and just to quickly sort of tie it back to my first point in all this, which is that generations seem to be very short in terms of life, have a short life in fandom. There's already another group of newer fans who have come online, so to speak. And what by that I mean sort of join the fandom and join the movement since 2019, who probably in a good way don't know anything about this. And I'm very encouraged, right? So it's just that every once in a while this will still come up. And it's just, again, I really dreaded having to get into this tonight, because it's one of those things where it's like, how much detail to get into? I don't want to relitigate it. Then again, to the extent that some people hear about it, I don't want them to be confused about it, right? But there it is, right? Anything else we need to say about this?
Yeah, I guess really, you kind of mentioned that, like, a lot of this was driven by a lot of the newer members of the community. But as you also said, it wasn't just the newer members. There was a lot of old guard members that kind of turned on us. I remember a mutual friend of both Jeremy and myself. The person that we met through basically turned on us during this time, as well as people who have helped out. Another very active member of the community, many so, also essentially overnight turned on us. And it wasn't just like how did I say? It was a combination of a lot of things, evidently, and I think everyone had their own little reasons. I think I think to a certain extent, a part of it was also the not to get too much into this, but the general increase in political polarization that's been happening kind of fed into this, and some perceived political affiliations that certain members of the community had may have influenced some people to turn in the way that they did, which is unfortunate, because the movement up until that point, and I think even still today, is relatively apolitical. I know at Twin Sons we have in our chats we do get into some pretty heated debate on the political issues, but we've always been able to, keep that side of it out, right? It's that we have these disagreements. We don't always agree on everything. We have some different ideas of where the broader world should go. But when it comes to this one issue of should legends continue, we're always united. We're united on it. We all agree. We can put aside those differences and work towards this common goal. And unfortunately, we found out that some people just couldn't do that.
Yeah, and that was the saddest part, because to the interesting byproduct of a movement that the EU fandom believes it needs in order to sort of advocate for more legends has a really important byproduct, and it is this EU community, which to be totally charitable to some of these people we're talking about, some of these actors, is something that they also cherished and wanted to hold on to, but genuinely believe that somehow we were involved in mucking it up. Now, nothing they said seemed to make any sense. I didn't understand the causation, right? Somehow they got mad that Twin Sons is putting up another billboard. Somehow that makes for racist. I mean, I didn't understand the logic, but okay, to be good faith, these are people who thought they were doing the right thing, still believe they probably did the right thing, despite the sort of the disastrous consequences. But that's ultimately the thing they endangered the most, was the community we have, right? That's the funny thing. Like, I don't remember them asking my political views, but you're right. There was this weird sort of like increasing polarization both in the country, around the globe. And I think that started to spill over into lots of sort of like online community fandom and stuff. People were on edge. They were almost looking to be overly sensitive, looking to be angry. But it's so funny. Yeah. I mean, I remember that happening too. A couple of people just sort of presuming they knew what our politics were. I don't remember anyone asking. I don't remember ever sharing my political views, which aren't very interesting to begin with. And what's so important, I mean, not to sound all sort of rosy, but it's like, Dylan, I don't know your political views either. And I don't care. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
The cool thing is, like, we can live in different parts of the country, be different ages, have different backgrounds, different experiences, but I have more in common with you than my neighbor, because of our love of the EU. And that's what's so powerful. And that's what sort of connected all of us, right? And that's always going to be like, that's the positive byproduct of all this. If we never get more legends from Lucasfilm, we have this really cool community of people around the globe we're all connected to in this really important way. And ironically, although these folks are trying to save the movement, they ended up potentially harming the byproduct of it, which is really this community,
Right.
And so, yeah, which is, again, the thing that has the power to connect us all, regardless of our politics, right? Again, I sound like I'm giving, like some sermon or something, right? But I think it's really true. So it caused a lot of discord, for sure. And I know, for all I know, there might still be, again, I know that some of those people, because occasionally they'll still talk about it, I know they think they were in the right. And again, that's fair enough. We'll agree to disagree. But I wonder to what extent some folks on the sidelines still, I don't know, think we're out to do wrong, or I don't know. But it's amazing to me that there were people there were valued friends and allies in the community who we lost, because I don't know. And it was still shocking to me that they saw the accusations and believed these things. I mean, crazy accusations that, like, Matt Wilkins was like stealing money or something. He wasn't even involved administratively with Twin Sons. I mean, how was that even possible? I mean, just the wildest things. So,
or that
it just,
well, the most common one, I don't know if we said this, was that the EU movement was getting too entwined with, again, the Fandom menace, when they shouldn't. When, as many times as we can say, we said it. We always said it. It's two different groups. Like, there's some overlap with some people who are into both, but it's never been, that's, I guess, the movement didn't really subscribe to the notion of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I guess, in a lot of ways, and they just couldn't understand that concept of, just because we are both, the loyal opposition and the not disloyal opposition, that doesn't mean we're on the same side.
Right. Well, that's it's funny you mentioned that. Yeah, I'm glad you said that because it reminded me of one other thing too. There was a lot of bad faith in all this. I think a lot of these actors, they imputed a lot more sort of rationality to what they perceived happening. Again, and there's one other thing I want to back up and talk about too. Again, alluded to this at the very beginning. As the as the fandom and as the movement starts to sort of disperse throughout a wide range of platforms, but in particular finds a home in YouTube, there's a funny thing about these different platforms. They all have a different language. They have a different culture, different ethic. I'll tell you, and this kind of relates to, and those change over time and evolve. And this kind of relates to some newer people sort of coming on board the movement and on particular platforms. And I don't know how to set this up, but a really weird thing happened. I remember when Twitter started. I'm old enough to remember when like Friendster was the big social media platform, right? I'm old enough to remember life online before social media, right? But I mean, I remember when Twitter started. The custom, the ethic was back in the day, you follow whoever follows you.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's still the case anymore. I'm just telling you, if you were around in the day, you probably remember that. That was one of the customs, right? So I remember, for instance, a lot of people start following me after 2017 on Twitter and the expandinguniverse.com account on Twitter. And what would I do? I'd follow them back. But I remember some of these actors, they would look at that and they'd go, see who they're following, see who he's following. They are endorsing this stuff. And I was always like, guys, it's a social media platform. I get followed, I follow back. That's just what I remember from 2009 or whatever it was I started Twitter, right? So it was funny, all of a sudden it was like their sense of what it meant to be on this platform and what was an endorsement, versus what was just the custom of you know what I mean, was really confusing. And the same for YouTube. And I learned something. I admittedly realized what an age gap apparently there was, right? Because yes, they called me the old guard. Yeah, I'm a lot older than a lot of the new fans, right? But really funny thing on YouTube, when I learned the English language and I learned the word collaborate, it meant something different than what I think a lot of young people say when they talk about collabs on YouTube, right? So if you and I are collaborating right now, we have on this list, we're collaborating, right, by trying to build this series together, right? There's a very conscious sort of intent and aim behind this, right? But I remember, I'll never forget the one time, and this is how I got wrapped into all this. I was on a panel discussion on a YouTube channel with me and a couple of the EU fans and a member of the Fandom Menace. Because of the way the word collab is used in the context of YouTube, right? It was sort of like able to, it was so weird. I mean, they were like, well, you collaborated with the Fandom Menace. How did I do that? Well, because you collabed on a video. How did I collab? Well, you appeared on a video. Appearing on another channel is collabing, and thus collaboration, and thus intent. I'm like, are you kidding me? So all of a sudden, like, all these social different media platforms have their own language, ethic, customs, stuff like that. And they were exploiting that, I think, to build a really sort of paranoid sort of spider web, right? About how, so ultimately what I'm getting at is they imputed a lot more rationality and intention behind all this, right? I remember they started putting words in our mouth and words in the movements and movements mouth too. And they started saying things like, oh, okay, well, I know why they're letting Fandom Menace folks on their channel to collab. It's because the Fandom Menace is having a certain degree of success and they want to improve their own numbers. They want the EU fandom to grow in numbers. So they want to kind of hitch their wagon to the Fandom Menace. Where did we ever say that? None of us even believe that? You know what I used to think? I used to think, oh, a Fandom Menacer wants to be on Matt Wilkins' channel. That must mean that Matt Wilkins is doing the right thing. They're coming to him because he's the only one, unlike any of their guys, actually talking about the EU.
Right.
We have a really valuable role in actually educating the Fandom Menace, who to a large degree is new to the EU, about what the EU is all about and the EU movement, right? So to me, it just seemed like, wow, like to deny them, access to these ideas is like gatekeeping in sort of the worst way, ironically, to sort of like keep it pure or something. But it was like, but they kept putting words in our mouth. And again, it's like I said with the political stuff. No one ever asked me my political views. They kept putting words in our mouth about the collabs. They never asked us why we were on the panel. You know what I mean? It's just, it was crazy. It just, in a word, that period of time it just it just sucked.
Yep.
It sucked. It was a horrible time. Yeah. So this is, and by the way, this is exactly what I wanted to avoid, is just me just ranting and ranting and ranting. But I should probably just stop talking now. I mean,
Yeah.
long
I
story
think
short,
I think we've
yeah,
covered enough of it that the people who weren't there should get a
yeah,
good idea of what was happening.
yeah. Well, good. And anything we missed in 2018, 2019? I think this has been pretty comprehensive.
Yeah. Now we were just talking about how 2018 had nothing, and then we came up in sense with like 10 more things to put in
I
2018.
know.
I'm now
It's
looking at 2020, and there's like 2 things on there, and I bet by the next time there's going to be like 10 more things on 2020.
I know. Yeah, right now, right. I mean, the big thing for 2020, just looking ahead for part four, is the second billboard, some other things there. I mean, 2021, of course, it's more recent, so it's been a bit easier to think about some things. But
Mhm.
2021 is, in a way, a bit like a 2019. There's a lot of ups, a lot of downs, but there's a lot of activity. And what's really nice about 2021 is that there's a lot in the way of EU content. Not so much new EU content, but lots of sort of repackaged, republished, remarketed EU. So that's nice. So you start to see kind of the elevation of republish EU content as a mainstay in the book trade, which is kind of nice, right? So a lot of fun stuff. We'll talk about 2020, 2021, and then I guess eventually wrap this up with 2022 and beyond. So yeah, any final words, or should we just end this sucker right now? Because I think this is the longest video so far.
Yeah, just if we missed anything, let us know. and
Let
if
us
we
know.
have,
Absolutely.
and if you have anything that you remember from 2020 or 2021, I guess put in the comments. I do read, and a couple of the things that I put in were from the community post you put out that I had seen, and I added them because we had forgotten about them. So those are helpful, even
Yeah,
if you think it's obvious that, of course, we had put on the list. Mention it anyway, because maybe we just both forgot about it.
absolutely. Yeah, we'll cover it next time. All right, that's it. See you guys for part four.